The year my daughter-in-law told me to eat Thanksgiving dinner in the garage, she did it with a smile so polished it almost passed for kindness. She stood in the doorway between her gleaming kitchen and the cold concrete room where they kept paint cans, golf clubs, and a second refrigerator, and she set a paper napkin beside a folding chair like she was doing me a favor. "I thought you'd be more comfortable out here, Margaret," she said, glancing past me at the dining room she had dressed in crystal and gold linen for the people she considered worth impressing. "Inside is a little crowded with the guests." I looked over her shoulder. There were 12 seats at that table. One of them had my late husband's name card holder in front of it, but my place card was gone. My chair, the walnut chair Henry had built with his own hands 40 years earlier, the one with the small carved rose on the backrest, because he said every woman deserved at least one piece of furniture made specifically for her, had been removed from the table and shoved against the garage wall to hold 3 winter coats and Vanessa's mother's designer handbag. My son saw it. He said nothing. So I walked into the garage carrying the sweet potato casserole I had made from Henry's recipe, the one David used to ask for every November when he was a boy, and I sat down beside a freezer humming louder than any human voice in that house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. And that was the moment they made their biggest mistake. Because 10 minutes later, the first guest pushed back his chair and stood up for me. Then another did the same. And another. By the time Vanessa realized what was happening, her beautiful dining room was nearly empty. Her guests were carrying their plates into the garage, and the woman who thought she had banished me to the shadows was standing alone under her chandelier with her mouth slightly open, finally understanding that she had just humiliated the wrong person. I am 68 years old, and silence has been one of the most useful tools of my life. Not the helpless kind. Not the kind people hide inside when they have no defense left. I mean deliberate silence. The kind that watches. The kind that remembers. The kind that lets other people reveal exactly who they are while they believe they are still in control. I learned that kind of silence when I was 23, pregnant with my son, balancing a ledger on a crate in a warehouse office with a leaking roof while my husband Henry negotiated freight rates with men who looked at him and saw a dreamer. They looked at me and saw less than that. A woman in a cotton dress with swollen ankles and an adding machine. Those men learned. Henry and I built Ellis Storage and Logistics from one truck, one rented loading dock, and more nerve than money. He handled people. I handled numbers, contracts, tax filings, debt restructuring, payroll, and the 1,000 invisible decisions that keep a business alive when everyone around it is waiting for it to die. By the time David was in college, we had 4 warehouses, a regional fleet, and enough stability to breathe without counting pennies first. We never became the kind of rich people who needed everyone to know they were rich. Maybe that was because we had spent too many years knowing exactly what it felt like not to be. We lived well, but we lived plainly. Henry drove his truck until the doors rattled. I kept a coat I loved for 15 years because it still fit and still kept me warm. We paid for David's education without making him carry loans. We helped his friends when they were short on rent. We donated anonymously because Henry used to say that if gratitude became a performance, it stopped being generosity. When Henry died, he had been gone only 6 weeks before people started speaking to me differently. That is another thing silence teaches you. The moment a woman's husband dies, a certain kind of person begins to look through her, not at her. Some assume her authority died with him. Some assume her grief made her soft. Some assume she no longer understands the machinery of money, property, or power. They lower their voices when discussing business in front of her, as if numbers become too complicated for a widow. They call her dear in a tone that means diminished. I buried Henry on a Tuesday. On Friday, I sat at the head of our boardroom table, opened the file he had last been working on, and finished the acquisition he had started. No one called me dear after that. David was 36 then. He had Henry's eyes and, once upon a time, Henry's decency. He was a gentle boy. Sensitive in ways children often get punished for, especially boys. He hated seeing anyone embarrassed. If a child sat alone at a birthday party, David was the one who walked over first. When I burned a pie crust one Christmas and apologized, he was 6 years old and solemnly told me black edges tasted grown up. He grew into a handsome man, the sort that made people trust him quickly. He also grew into one of those men who wanted life to be smooth. He disliked conflict, disliked unpleasantness, disliked saying no in the moment even when it meant betraying something important later. Henry used to worry about that. He's good-hearted, I told him once. Henry nodded and said, yes. But goodness without backbone becomes permission in other people's hands. I didn't understand how right he was until Vanessa. She came into our lives in a navy dress that cost too much and a smile that never fully reached her eyes. David brought her to a charity auction downtown, and I remember exactly what I thought the first time she shook my hand. Not that she was rude. She wasn't. Vanessa was too practiced for open rudeness. What I felt was something colder and more precise. Assessment. Her gaze moved over me the way women like Vanessa move over a room they intend to organize. My shoes. My hair. My wedding ring. My handbag. The fact that I wore no visible labels and did not seem eager to compensate for that. She tilted her head slightly when I told her I handled the financial side of the company, as if privately adjusting a number in her mind. Her mother, Celeste Mercer, was worse. Celeste had perfected the art of sounding gracious while insulting people line by line. She came from the kind of family that talked about old standards as if their silverware had been forged at the birth of civilization. But I had spent enough years around banks and real estate attorneys to know the difference between old money and heavily mortgaged performance. Celeste and her husband had lost more than one property to refinancing schemes hidden beneath tasteful wallpaper. But Celeste wore cashmere like armor and spoke as if every room had been waiting all day for her arrival. At first, I made an effort. I invited Vanessa to lunch. I took interest in her work as an event consultant. I listened when she described floral installations with the seriousness of military operations. I let her help choose table linens for David's birthday. I gave her my mother's silver pie server at their engagement dinner because she admired it once, and I thought foolishly, perhaps, that admiration might become attachment and attachment might become care. Henry had been dead only a year when David proposed. He wanted my blessing, and I gave it. Not because I was blind, but because love is one of those things mothers are told to trust even when every instinct is leaning back in its chair with folded arms. The first 3 years after their wedding taught me more than the 20 years before it. Disrespect rarely arrives as a slap. It arrives in edits. Vanessa began by correcting small things that did not need correcting. If I said supper, she laughed lightly and repeated dinner as if translating for the room. If I brought flowers, she rearranged them while thanking me. If I offered to help in her kitchen, she said, "Oh no, it's probably easier if I keep my system." When I wore a tailored wool coat that had served me well for a decade, she asked whether I had ever thought about updating my silhouette. She called me Margaret instead of Mom, which I would not have minded if it hadn't been paired with a tone that made my own name feel like something placed on a shelf. The gifts told their own story. One Christmas, David gave Celeste a weekend at a spa resort in Vermont. He gave me a scented candle Vanessa had clearly picked up in a rush on the way to brunch. It still had the price sticker on the bottom. He noticed only when I turned it in my hands. Vanessa handled the wrapping, he said, embarrassed. I smiled and told him it smelled lovely. It did not. It smelled like peonies trying too hard. On Mother's Day, Vanessa posted a photo of herself with Celeste under the caption, celebrating the woman who taught me grace, style, and strength. She texted me 6 hours later, "Hope you're enjoying your day." David called that evening from their patio and said, "You know how social media is, Mom. Don't read into it. Don't read into it." That became the family anthem for a while. When they moved into the stone-faced house in West Haven, Vanessa referred to it constantly as our house, but the down payment had come from me. Not as a gift exactly, though I had never chosen to make the distinction ugly. After Henry died, I restructured our holdings. The company sat under Ellis Family Holdings, and several properties, including the West Haven house, were purchased through a trust-managed LLC designed to protect family assets from lawsuits, divorces, bad debt, and impulsive decisions. David signed every document. Arthur Rosen, our attorney, explained them clearly. David nodded, impatient to leave for a tea time. What mattered to him was that he and Vanessa got to live in a house with a 3-car garage, vaulted ceilings, and a kitchen big enough to host the kind of dinners Vanessa staged like campaigns. What mattered to me was that my son and future grandchildren would always have a roof no matter how foolish the world became. I never told Vanessa that her marble island, her breakfast nook, her walk-in pantry, and the heated bathroom floors she loved bragging about were all technically under structures I controlled. I didn't tell her because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted peace. Peace is expensive when you buy it with self-erasure. The older I got, the more I understood how many women of my generation had been trained to call that price reasonable. We were told to keep families intact, keep the table set, keep the children from discomfort, keep our opinions soft enough not to bruise anyone's pride. We learned to smooth things over so well that people stopped noticing the raw skin on our hands. I kept trying because of David and later because of Sophie. Sophie was 7 when she first asked why Grandma's house smelled like safety. I laughed at that, but I knew what she meant. My cottage, the smaller house I moved into after Henry died, still held the rhythm of a real home. It smelled like coffee and cedar and whatever was in the oven. It had blankets people were allowed to use and books people were allowed to touch. It had no white velvet chairs nobody could sit in. When Sophie stayed with me, she made forts out of quilts and asked questions no one else had time for. She liked my old photo albums and my blue kitchen mugs and the basket of mismatched scarves by the door. Vanessa called it clutter. Sophie called it stories. Children notice everything adults train themselves not to see. Once, when Sophie was 8, she leaned close while Vanessa was loading gifts into the car after Christmas and whispered, "Grandma, Mommy says your house is cozy because it's small, but I think she means old." I kissed the top of her head and told her old things lasted longer. Vanessa did not like that Sophie preferred my kitchen to hers. She did not like that David relaxed more at my table than at his own. She did not like that certain people in town still came to me first on matters involving business, schools, charities, or practical judgment. Vanessa wanted a version of family that photographed beautifully and obeyed seating arrangements. I represented the older gravity she couldn't curate. The first time she truly showed me who she was, we were at a restaurant called Maison Bleu, one of those places where the portions are decorative and the napkins feel like they require a degree to unfold correctly. She had asked me to lunch because, in her words, we should invest in our relationship. I arrived 5 minutes early. Vanessa arrived 12 minutes late, kissed the air beside my cheek, and ordered sparkling water without looking at the menu. She wore cream silk in February and the expression of a woman tolerating weather as a personal insult. She spoke for 20 minutes about a holiday fundraiser she was organizing, about floral budgets and donor optics and guest lists. Then she said, very gently, "There's something I've been wanting to discuss, Margaret. I hope you won't take it the wrong way. People who say that have already decided how you are allowed to take it." She placed both hands around her glass and smiled. Sometimes I think David feels torn between the life we're building and certain older expectations. I stirred my tea and asked, "Which expectations?" She hesitated just long enough to make the pause seem thoughtful. Obligation. Guilt. Tradition for tradition's sake. You know, he's such a good son, and sometimes good sons are vulnerable to emotional pressure. I looked at her for a long time before answering. Are you telling me my son feels pressured by loving his mother? Her face softened into sympathy. It was almost theatrical. No. Of course not. I'm only saying that in order for a marriage to flourish, the husband has to put his household first. And by household, I asked, "You mean you?" She laughed then, a short polished laugh that came out more brittle than amused. You have such a sharp sense of humor. It wasn't humor. I finished my tea, paid the check before she could reach for it, and on the way out she touched my elbow and said, "I do hope we can always be honest with each other." I remember turning to her beneath the restaurant's brass light fixtures and saying, "Honesty is valuable, Vanessa. That's why I never decorate it." She didn't like me after that. Not because I had insulted her. Because I had seen her. Time kept moving. It always does, whether or not a family is deserving of it. David moved further into the company with my blessing and Nora Delgado's supervision. Nora had started in our first warehouse at 21, tough as a rail spike, doing dispatch work while taking night classes in operations management. Henry loved her. I trusted her. By the time I stepped back from daily leadership, Nora was COO, and she knew more about our internal systems than any consultant David ever wanted to impress. David had charm and a last name that opened certain doors. Nora had competence. I intended them to balance each other. Vanessa resented Nora almost immediately. "She's very direct," Vanessa said once after a Christmas party, wrinkling her nose over the word as if it smelled too industrial. "She's effective," I replied. Vanessa sighed. "Not everyone wants their business to feel like a loading dock, Margaret." That sentence stayed with me longer than she intended. Because what she meant was not about business at all. She meant she had no respect for the hands that build the stage once the audience arrives. By the year of the Thanksgiving incident, the tension in our family had stopped being subtle. David had begun missing Sunday dinners unless there was a practical benefit to attending. Vanessa increasingly treated family gatherings like branding opportunities. Celeste hovered at the edges of everything like perfume you couldn't wash out. There were conversations about repositioning assets, about whether the lake house should be sold, about whether my cottage was more space than you needed, as if a widow's life should naturally contract to make other people more comfortable. What none of them fully understood was that Henry and I had built every protective wall they were leaning on. The lake house was in a trust. The West Haven property was in a trust. The majority voting shares remained under my control as trustee until my death or voluntary transfer. Discretionary distributions to David were exactly that, discretionary. We had not set things up that way because we distrusted our son. We had done it because Henry spent enough years negotiating with desperate men to know that weakness can arrive wearing someone else's smile. By autumn that year, David and Vanessa were hosting more aggressively than ever. Vanessa wanted into a higher social tier, and West Haven was the kind of neighborhood where invitations worked like currency. She began speaking about our Thanksgiving in October, as if she had been appointed cultural minister of the season. She had custom menu cards printed. She hired a rental company for extra stemware. She told me, in a tone so bright it almost hurt, that she was doing a refined table cape and hoped I wouldn't bring anything too rustic. Too rustic. That was how she referred to the dishes my husband had loved. The dishes my son had grown up on. The dishes his daughter still asked for. I said I understood. Then I made the sweet potato casserole anyway. I also baked the bourbon pecan pie David used to steal slices from while it was cooling on the windowsill. Some memories deserve a chance to return before they're buried. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold, the sort of November day where the sky looks like it has forgotten color on purpose. I woke before dawn, as I always do, and stood for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen with both hands around my blue ceramic mug. Henry had chipped the handle on that mug 20 years earlier while trying to hang Christmas lights from a ladder he was too stubborn to let anyone hold for him. I kept using it because damage never frightened me when it came from life instead of malice. The cottage was warm. Butter was softening on the counter. Cinnamon and roasted pecans had settled into the curtains. I had already pressed my cranberry-colored blouse and laid out the pearl earrings Henry once gave me after our first profitable year. They were small pearls. We couldn't afford large ones then. I treasured them more than I would have treasured anything larger. As the casserole baked, I took out an old photograph from the drawer beside the telephone. Henry was in the garage at our first house, sleeves rolled up, sawdust on his forearms, building the walnut dining chairs one by one because store-bought chairs cost more than lumber and because he liked making things that lasted. David, 8 years old, stood beside him holding sandpaper with a solemn expression, like he had been entrusted with royal work. In the photograph, his front tooth is missing. Henry is laughing at something outside the frame. I slipped the photo back into the drawer and told myself, as I had told myself so many times over the years, that memory is not a shelter if you live in it too long. At 11:30, I covered the casserole dish with foil, placed the pie in the back seat, and drove to West Haven. Vanessa's house looked exactly the way she wanted her life to look from the street: expensive, coordinated, and faintly vacant. Two black SUVs in the driveway. Copper lanterns by the stone entry. Fresh wreaths on every front-facing window. Through the front glass, I could already see hired votives lining the hall console. A valet would not have surprised me. Celeste opened the front door before I could ring the bell. She wore cream cashmere and gold hoops and looked me over in a way I had come to recognize as one of her hobby interests. "Margaret," she said, smiling with her teeth but not her eyes. "You made it. I wasn't sure that little car of yours could handle the hill." "My little car made it just fine," I said. She glanced at the casserole dish in my hands. "Oh, you brought food after all." "I was asked to bring bread," I said. "I brought memory instead." Her smile thinned. "How lovely." Inside, the house smelled of rosemary, citrus polish, and a turkey I would later learn had been prepared by a catering assistant who arrived at 7 in the morning. Vanessa believed in appearing effortless by employing exhaustion in others. The entry table held place cards written in looping gold ink. The living room had been arranged into a magazine spread. Tall arrangements of white branches and copper leaves flanked the fireplace. A string trio recording played softly through the hidden speakers. I could hear glassware clinking and the low buzz of practiced conversation from the back of the house. Vanessa came toward me in a fitted dark green dress, her hair pinned in a way that suggested labor but announced elegance. She kissed the air beside my face and said, "Happy Thanksgiving." "Oh good, you didn't wear black." "For a second, I worried you might." "I save mourning clothes for actual losses," I said. She blinked. "Right." David appeared a moment later, handsome and distracted, already half-host, half-apologetic son. He hugged me, though it was the kind of hug men give when their mind is still on the next room. "You okay, Mom? Traffic bad?" "Traffic was polite," I said. He laughed too quickly. "Good. Great. We've got some important people here today." Leonard Pike came, and the Whitakers, and a few folks from Vanessa's charity board. "Try not to disappear before dessert. Try not to disappear." I looked at him. He did not hear himself. Sophie came running in then, saving him from my answer. She nearly crashed into my legs and wrapped both arms around me. "Grandma, I told Mommy you'd make the good potatoes anyway." Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Sophie," inside voice. I bent down and kissed Sophie's hair. "Happy Thanksgiving, darling." She lowered her voice to a whisper. "Mommy said the table is too fancy for accidents. Children hear class warfare and translate it into practical fear." I straightened and handed the casserole dish to the kitchen assistant Vanessa had hired for the day. "Please keep that warm," I said. "And be careful with the dish." Vanessa waved a hand. "We may not have room for everything, but we'll see." I knew that tone. It meant my food would be treated as optional until someone important praised it. The guests were exactly the kind Vanessa collected for effect. Leonard Pike, a retired judge with a voice like polished oak. His wife, Evelyn, who volunteered at the hospital with the kind of quiet efficiency I respected. The Whitakers, whose family foundation funded local education programs. Two couples from Vanessa's social orbit, dressed in deep autumn tones and expensive confidence. A cardiologist and his husband. One of David's banking contacts. Celeste's cousin Franklin, who fancied himself a real estate visionary because he once sold 3 condos during a seller's market and never recovered from the flattery. And there, near the bar cart, speaking with Nora Delgado, was Thomas Avery, a senior lending partner from Franklin State, one of the banks evaluating David's proposal for a major expansion under Ellis Holdings. Thomas had known me since he was a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school. I had once spent 4 hours in his office explaining the difference between risk and theater. When he saw me, his face opened into genuine warmth. "Margaret." "Thomas." He stepped forward and clasped my hands. "Still the only person in this county who can terrify a lender with a single spreadsheet." "Only the dishonest ones," I said. Nora smiled into her wine. "That's still too many." Vanessa noticed the exchange. I watched her file it away. That is what people like her do when they find an influence they failed to map. Lunch hour hosting rolled toward dinner in polished waves. I was useful but not central. Vanessa directed servers. Celeste evaluated floral symmetry. David floated between rooms. I moved where I was needed and where I was not in the way. I refilled Sophie's cider. I answered Judge Pike's questions about the scholarship fund. I listened to Nora give Thomas a measured update on the warehouse automation rollout. Every now and then, I caught David looking relieved that I was behaving. Behaving. It's an interesting word. Adults use it when they mean enduring mistreatment without disrupting the mood. Just before dinner, I went looking for the powder room near the dining room hallway and passed the table as final candles were being lit. That was when I noticed the chair. Or rather, the absence of it. The dining room had been extended with 2 additional leaves, dressed in layered linen, gold-rimmed china, folded napkins tied with velvet ribbon, and 12 polished chairs. 11 upholstered side chairs and 1 carved walnut chair that should have been at the table had been replaced with an upholstered one. The walnut chair was missing. My husband's chair for me. The chair that had sat at our family table through birthdays, fevers, Christmas mornings, tuition arguments, college acceptance letters, funeral casseroles, and every Thanksgiving David had ever eaten until the year Vanessa decided heritage looked too provincial. I stood very still. There are moments when your whole body knows something before your mind allows it into language. Vanessa appeared beside me carrying a stack of place cards, as if she had been waiting for this exact discovery. "Oh," she said lightly. "I was just coming to find you." I turned to her. She lowered her voice, but not enough. "We had to make a small adjustment." "What kind of adjustment?" Her eyes flicked toward the dining room. "Well, with the guest list and the flow and everything, it made the most sense to seat you somewhere quieter." "Quieter?" "Yes." She smiled. "You know how these evenings can get. A little overwhelming. And you and I both know you don't enjoy all the networking." I stared at her until the shape of her sentence collapsed. "Where exactly," I asked, "am I sitting?" She gestured behind her with 2 fingers, almost cheerful. "We set up a little place for you in the garage. It's heated." For a moment I thought I had misheard her. Maybe because some humiliations are so obscene that the mind rejects them on first contact. The garage. The room where the cars slept warmer than human feeling. The room where she had sent the extra ice, the caterer's supplies, and now, apparently, me. I looked past her toward the kitchen, where David stood talking to Thomas Avery with a hand in his pocket. He was close enough to hear if he wanted to hear. Close enough to intervene if he wanted to intervene. Close enough to choose. He glanced over. Our eyes met. And then he looked away. Not dramatically. Not with guilt so obvious it could be condemned. Just a smooth, practiced turning of the head toward a conversation he suddenly found more urgent than his mother being removed from the family table. That hurt more than Vanessa's words. Because cruelty from outsiders wounds the skin. Cowardice from your child goes deeper. Celeste appeared at Vanessa's shoulder like a finishing touch. "It really is the best solution, Margaret. You'll have more room. And some older people prefer not to be in the center of things." I could have answered 100 different ways. I could have said this was my son's house and name, but my structure in law. I could have reminded them who paid the taxes on the lake house for years while David built the resume Vanessa liked bragging about. I could have said that Henry built that chair before either of them had the good fortune to exist in our family. I said none of it. I asked one question instead. Did David agree to this? Vanessa folded her arms loosely, as if bored by logistics. David trusts me to manage the evening. That was answer enough. I nodded once. Of course, I said. Then I walked past them. The garage was clean in the way people keep spaces clean when they never intend to sit in them. The floor had been swept, the bins stacked neatly, the sports equipment pushed against the wall. A small card table stood near the second refrigerator. On it sat one plain plate, one glass of water, rolled silverware, and a single cloth napkin that clearly belonged to the rejected pile from the dining room set. The folding chair was metal, cold through my skirt even in the heated room. My walnut chair was 4 feet away, pressed against the wall beneath the hanging coats. Vanessa had draped Celeste's camel wrap over its back. There are insults, and then there are symbols. I put my hand on that chair for a moment before I sat down at the folding table. The carved rose on the backrest brushed my palm like an old pulse. Henry had sanded that wood until midnight because he kept saying my shoulder blades deserved a chair that understood them. I sat in the folding chair instead. The door to the house remained open a crack. I could hear laughter from the dining room, the clink of serving spoons, someone complimenting the centerpieces, Vanessa's bright voice carrying through the gap like polished glass. I could smell turkey and thyme and the sweet potatoes I had made, and that room would eat without me. I folded my hands in my lap. I thought of Henry. I thought of the years I had spent making sure David never had to feel small at his own table. I thought of every check, every favor, every practical rescue done quietly enough that later it could be mistaken for background noise. Then I heard footsteps. For one brief second, I assumed it was David, finally growing a spine late, but not too late. It was Sophie. She slipped into the garage in white tights and velvet shoes and looked at the card table with immediate horror. "Grandma," she whispered, "why are you here?" I smiled because children should never carry the full ugliness of adults if we can help it. "Looks like your mother found me a quiet corner." "That's stupid," Sophie said, with the clear moral certainty only 9-year-olds and saints possess. Before I could answer, Vanessa's voice sliced in from the doorway. "Sophie, back inside." "Now." Sophie turned. "But Grandma." "Now." Sophie looked at me, not her mother. I nodded once. She went. A minute later, another pair of footsteps approached. Slower. Heavier. Judge Leonard Pike stood in the doorway holding his napkin in one hand. He took in the folding chair, the card table, the coats, the freezer, and then me. His face changed. Not with theatrics. With understanding. He was a man old enough to recognize humiliation when he saw it because he had spent too much of life watching people dress it in polite language. "Margaret," he said quietly, "what on earth is this?" I could have lied for them. Women of my generation are expert tailors of disgrace. We hem it, line it, and present it as preference. But something in me had gone still by then. I looked at him and said, "Apparently, this is where I'm seated." He stared at me for a beat, then turned and walked back toward the dining room without another word. I heard his chair scrape. Then his voice, calm and carrying. "If Margaret Ellis is eating in the garage, then I will be joining her." Silence followed him like a dropped curtain. Then another chair moved. Evelyn Pike said, "So will I." Then Nora's voice, same. Thomas Avery, sharper than the rest, added, "I'm not comfortable staying at a table where the host's mother has been placed beside a lawnmower." Someone murmured, someone gasped, and then I heard a sound I will never forget. The sound of a room full of people deciding, one by one, what kind of person they wanted to be. Footsteps. Plates lifted. Napkins unfolded and refold. When the first guest came into the garage carrying his dinner plate, he was followed by another and another until the space filled with people too dignified to pretend they hadn't seen what had been done. Judge Pike set his plate on a workbench and dragged over an overturned crate for himself. Evelyn took a garden stool. Nora leaned against the freezer with her wineglass balanced like defiance. Thomas Avery stood near my walnut chair, lifted Celeste's wrap from it without ceremony, folded it once, and placed it on a shelf. Then he pulled out the chair and said, "Mrs. Ellis, I think you should have your proper seat." For the first time all evening, my throat tightened. I rose from the folding chair and sat in the walnut chair Henry had built for me. The carved rose pressed against my back like memory and mercy at once. No one spoke loudly. No one made a production. That was the grace of it. Their loyalty was not theatrical. It was simply unmistakable. Judge Pike lifted his fork and said, "Now then. Since we're having Thanksgiving in the only honest room in the house, perhaps someone can pass the sweet potatoes." A few people laughed. Real laughter. Warm and incredulous. I saw Vanessa then, standing in the doorway to the kitchen where the light hit her face hard enough to show every crack in composure. David was behind her, pale and furious in the wrong direction, as if he could not decide whether to be angry at the guests for seeing too much or angry at himself for letting it happen. Celeste looked as if she had been personally insulted by democracy. Vanessa tried to recover. "Everyone, please, this is being misunderstood." Margaret wanted something quieter. "No," I said. It was the first word I had spoken into the room since the humiliation began. Just that one syllable. No louder than necessary. But it cut straight through her. The garage went still. Vanessa blinked. I did not ask to eat in the garage. No one moved. I looked at the faces around me. Judge Pike, Nora, Thomas, Evelyn, David, Sophie peeking around the doorway with wide eyes. Even Celeste, who had always mistaken my restraint for uncertainty. Then I added, calmly, your wife told me the dining room was for guests. David's face drained. Vanessa opened her mouth and closed it. Because there are lies people can tell, and then there are lies they understand will die in public before they are fully born. The silence after that sentence was the kind people remember years later. Not noisy. Not explosive. Irrevocable. Judge Pike set down his fork. Well, he said, that clarifies things. Thomas Avery looked at David with a level expression. It certainly does. No one returned to the dining room. Not one of them. Vanessa stood there for another 5 seconds, perhaps waiting for her status to obey her and restore itself. When it didn't, she turned abruptly and disappeared into the kitchen. Celeste followed. David remained in the doorway, frozen by the reality that a man can lose the room long before he loses the house. Sophie slipped in and sat on an upturned paint bucket beside me. I put a napkin on her lap. We ate Thanksgiving dinner in that garage. Judge Pike told a story about his first case as a public defender. Evelyn asked me for the casserole recipe. Nora, with dry delight, informed Thomas that the automation rollout would be completed under budget whether David learned humility or not. Thomas, who had spent years in rooms where everyone lied politely about ethics until money forced truth out of them, seemed almost relieved to be somewhere honesty, had chosen a freezer as its backdrop. At one point, Sophie said very loudly, "This food tastes better out here." No one corrected her. It did. Because dignity is an ingredient, and the dining room had run out of it. I stayed exactly 1 hour after dinner began. Long enough to thank the people who had shown me what character looks like when it is asked to stand up. Long enough for Vanessa's curated evening to become unrecoverable. Long enough for David to understand that silence can shame a person more thoroughly than shouting ever could. Before I left, I went back to the kitchen to retrieve my casserole dish. Vanessa was at the island, gripping the marble edge so tightly her knuckles looked powdered. Celeste stood beside her whispering fast, poisonous things. David was by the sink, staring at nothing. The caterer's assistant had disappeared entirely, which I respected. I lifted the casserole dish and the pie plate. Vanessa finally spoke. "I hope you're happy." I looked at her, then at David. "No," I said. "I'm clear." Then I walked out. That night, after I changed into my robe and washed the smell of their house from my hands, I sat in my living room with only the lamp near Henry's chair turned on. The cottage was quiet. Outside, wind worried the bare branches against the eaves. The blue mug sat half full of coffee gone cold because I had forgotten to drink it. My phone began lighting up before I had even taken off my earrings. First Vanessa. Then David. Then Celeste. Then David again. Then an unknown number I did not answer because by then I understood the performance entering its second act. I let the calls go to voicemail. There are times when listening to people explain themselves too early only muddies what is already obvious. At 10:40, I pressed play. Vanessa first. Her voice was tight, injured in the way only aggressors sound when witnesses have interfered. "Margaret, I think the evening got very out of hand because of a misunderstanding that you did nothing to correct. The garage was heated and set properly. I was trying to accommodate everyone and, frankly, you know how overwhelmed you can get in large social situations. I would appreciate it if you called me back so we can discuss this like adults." Then Celeste. I have never seen such manipulation in my life. To sit there and let those people think, well, I suppose now we know what sort of mother creates guilt in her son. Then David. He waited longer between words, which somehow made them worse. "Mom." It's David. "Look, I know today wasn't ideal. But you let it become a scene. There were business relationships in that room. Important ones. Vanessa was under pressure. You know how much this meant to her. I need you to understand that public embarrassment helps no one." I listened to the message twice. Not because I doubted what I had heard. Because sometimes betrayal sounds so childish in the mouth of a grown man that you need a second hearing just to believe it belongs to your son. Public embarrassment helps no one. There it was. The creed of cowards everywhere. Not that the wrong was wrong, but that its exposure was inconvenient. I set the phone down and looked around the room Henry and I had furnished with care, not fashion. The reading lamp he chose because it cast warm light on tired eyes. The wool throw we bought on a trip we could barely afford. The walnut sideboard I refinished one summer with my own hands. The framed photograph of David at 12 in a paper pilgrim hat, grinning over a too large turkey baster as if Thanksgiving were the holiest form of mischief. I closed my eyes. And all at once the years rearranged themselves into a pattern I could no longer afford to ignore. Vanessa had not invented the cruelty at that table. She had merely exercised power she believed had been granted to her. The person who granted it was my son. Not with documents. With omissions. With every time he chose ease over truth. Every time he let Vanessa edit me downward to preserve household calm. Every time he told me not to read into things. Every time he accepted my support while allowing my dignity to be treated like a negotiable detail. He had not become cruel in one afternoon. He had become convenient to cruelty. I slept very little that night. By morning, grief had burned down into something cleaner. Decision. I got dressed in charcoal wool, pinned my hair back, and drove to Arthur Rosen's office at 9:30 without calling ahead. Arthur had known me 32 years. He knew my face well enough to tell the difference between temporary hurt and permanent conclusion before I sat down. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building downtown, above a tailor and beside a travel agency that still used printed posters in the window like the internet had been a passing phase. Arthur's receptionist took one look at me and said, "He'll want coffee brought in." "He always thinks paperwork requires witnesses," I said. She smiled and disappeared. Arthur came out from behind the inner door with his glasses in one hand. 71, silver-haired, carefully dressed, and incapable of legal imprecision. "Margaret." "Arthur." He studied my face. "Whatever happened, come into my office before you tell me." That made me laugh once, without humor. His office smelled of leather, paper, and the particular steadiness of men who bill by the hour, but think by the decade. I sat in the chair opposite his desk and placed my handbag in my lap. He closed the door, sat down, and waited. I told him everything. Not dramatically. Chronologically. Vanessa. The garage. David's silence. The guests moving. The voicemail. I did not embellish. I did not need to. The facts had already done the work. Arthur listened with his fingertips pressed together. When I finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and said, "I assume you are not here for emotional reassurance." "No. What are you here for?" I looked at the wall behind him for a second, where framed copies of old trust certificates hung beside photographs of Arthur shaking hands with people wealthier than they deserved. Then I said, "I'm here because I have confused protection with indulgence, and I intend to stop." Arthur nodded once. "What level of stop?" "Full review." He leaned back. "All right." I knew exactly what that meant. We went through the structure piece by piece. The West Haven house, owned by Hawthorne Residential LLC, wholly held by the Ellis Family Trust, with David and Vanessa as licensed occupants under a revocable occupancy agreement tied to David's employment relationship and discretionary family support provisions. The discretionary distributions, annual living supplements, educational allocations, and certain reimbursable expenses, all within the trustee's judgment. The corporate shares, majority voting control retained by me, with succession language not yet transferred. The lake house, inaccessible to sale without trustee approval. The grandchildren's education trust, independent, protected. The family bylaws, enforceable ethics and misuse provisions regarding company assets, including personal entertaining charged to corporate accounts. Arthur opened file after file. He had warned me years earlier not to blur law and love too thoroughly. I had done it anyway. "What do you want to do first?" he asked. "The house stipend ends." He made a note. "David's successor status is suspended pending review." Another note. "I want a full audit of company-funded personal expenses attached to his office or household in the last 3 years." Arthur looked up. "That will create fallout." "It should. What about Vanessa?" She receives nothing directly from me. She never did. He gave the smallest ghost of a smile. You were not as trusting as you feared. No, just slower to act. I took a breath. Also, I said, I want my will revised. Arthur stopped writing. That is not a small step. Neither was what happened yesterday. Are you disinheriting David? I looked out the window at the gray downtown street, at people carrying coffee and grocery bags and private burdens. Then I answered carefully. I am redirecting what was always meant to be legacy into structure instead of assumption. Sophie and any future grandchildren remain protected. David no longer receives the benefit of being mistaken for a man I thought he was. Arthur said nothing for a few seconds. Then he slid a legal pad toward me. All right. Start talking. We'll draft with precision. It took nearly 3 hours. By the time I left, the first wave had already begun. Arthur would send formal notice regarding trust distributions. He would prepare revised will documents. He would notify Hawthorne Residential that occupancy arrangements were under review. And he would coordinate with Nora, discreetly but thoroughly, on an internal expense audit. I drove from Arthur's office straight to the original warehouse on Fletcher Road. The first warehouse still smelled the same in cold weather: diesel, cardboard, coffee, and effort. The loading bays had been modernized. The dispatch room used digital tracking now. But if you stood near the old office window and closed your eyes, you could still hear the life Henry and I had built out of risk and repetition. Nora was on the mezzanine reviewing freight reports when I arrived. She looked down, saw me, and came down the metal stairs 2 at a time. Arthur called, she said without preamble. Of course he did. You want to do this now? Yes. Nora studied me. She had known me long enough to hear what sat beneath that single word. All right. We went into the old conference room, where Henry's first route map still hung framed on the far wall. Nora laid out expense summaries, project proposals, and pending financing requests. David's expansion plan for a speculative mixed-use distribution center had already worried her. Too much leverage, too much vanity architecture, too many promises built on optimistic forecasts and Franklin Mercer's overconfident cousin. I've been carrying him, she said finally, not with bitterness but exhaustion. On operations, on cost assumptions, on vendor discipline. He wants the title of visionary without the discipline of one. What about misuse? She slid a separate folder toward me. Company-paid landscaping beyond policy limits at West Haven. Catering charges labeled as investor engagement. Chauffeur reimbursements. Home staging consultations buried under hospitality codes. A holiday lighting expense large enough to brighten a minor airport. I looked at the numbers without changing expression. This was the danger of quiet rescue. It becomes infrastructure for entitlement. Did you confront him? Twice. Nora folded her arms. He said appearances matter at his level. And did you say what Henry would have said? She gave me a sharp smile. I said if a man needs a $6,000 floral budget to prove leadership, he is not leading anything. Good. Nora's face softened. Margaret, are you sure you want to make this official? Because once the board sees it, there's no walking it back to family business. I thought of the folding chair in the garage. It stopped being family business when my daughter-in-law seated me beside antifreeze to protect centerpieces. Nora looked away for a moment, perhaps because even she, with all her hard edges, was not immune to outrage. Then we do it correctly, she said. We always do. The next 5 days were some of the quietest of my life. Externally, at least. Inside other people's homes, the noise was beginning. On Monday afternoon, David's corporate card declined at a restaurant where he was meeting Franklin Mercer's cousin about the expansion project. The assistant at the bank called to say certain discretionary authorizations had been frozen pending documentation. On Tuesday morning, Vanessa's favorite florist requested payment on an invoice previously routed to a hospitality account that no longer existed. The landscaping company left a polite voicemail saying future services required direct billing. The designer she had hired for holiday enhancements emailed with a revised contract and deposit demand. By Tuesday night, my phone was ringing every 2 hours. I did not answer. By Wednesday, David came to my cottage unannounced. I saw his car through the front window while I was kneading bread. He stood on the porch for a full minute before knocking, as if some part of him still expected the old version of me to open the door, already apologizing for making things hard. I wiped my hands, opened the door, and said, "You should have called." He looked terrible. Dark circles. Jaw tight. Good coat thrown on in haste. His resemblance to Henry hurt me all over again when he was distressed. That was one of the cruelest details. Love does not vanish just because clarity arrives. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He entered my kitchen, glanced automatically toward the coffee pot, the bread dough, the blue mug, the exact scene that had steadied him since childhood, and I watched comfort try to rise in him before pride shoved it back down. "What's going on?" he said. I kept kneading. "You're going to need to be more specific." "My accounts. West Haven. Arthur. Nora. People are acting like..." He stopped himself. "Mom, what did you do?" I dusted flour from my fingers and turned to face him. "I stopped pretending that gratitude and decency are optional." He exhaled sharply. "This is about Thanksgiving." "No," I said. "This is about everything Thanksgiving finally made impossible to ignore." He rubbed a hand over his mouth. "Vanessa made a bad call. I know that. We both know it was insensitive. But this? Freezing distributions? Triggering an audit? Threatening the house. Inappropriate seating was the symptom, David, not the disease. You're blowing this up." I almost smiled. People say that when consequences arrive at the same speed as their denial. "I'm correcting scale," I said. "You have spent years accepting support you now speak of as if it were your entitlement. You have let your wife treat me like an inconvenience while living inside walls I paid to secure. You approved personal spending through company channels. You ignored Nora. You ignored me. And when your wife sent me to the garage on Thanksgiving, you looked away." His face hardened, because shame in a weak man often reaches first for anger. "I was trying to keep the peace." "No. You were trying to keep the evening easy for yourself. That's not fair." I stepped closer then, not loud, not threatening, simply done with allowing him escape hatches. "You know what isn't fair?" I asked. "A woman spending 40 years building stability so her son can inherit safety, only to be treated like dead weight the moment his wife wants to impress donors. You stood there while she removed me from my own family table. Do not come into my kitchen and ask fairness to rescue you now." He looked down. For a second, I saw the boy he had been. The one who cried when a stray dog limped near the warehouse fence. The one Henry taught to hold a door for his mother not because she was fragile, but because respect is a habit before it is a principle. Then the man returned. Tired. Defensive. Cornered. "What do you want from me?" Such a revealing question. Not what was right. What did I want? I wanted a son who would say, "My mother does not eat in the garage." He flinched. "I wanted you to stop confusing your wife's preferences with moral law." His voice dropped. "You hate Vanessa." "I do not hate her." I picked up the dough again and pressed my palms into it. "I see her clearly. There's a difference." He stood there another moment, shoulders tight. "If this is about money, say that. It stopped being about money years ago. Money was simply the language in which you were willing to hear me." That landed. He left 5 minutes later without coffee. That had never happened before. Vanessa called that evening from an unknown number after I blocked the first 2. Her voice came in hot and bright and close to breaking. "I cannot believe the lengths you are going to over a dining arrangement." "It wasn't a dining arrangement," I said. "Oh, please. Spare me the martyrdom. You let those people humiliate me in my own home." I was standing at the window, watching rain stripe the dark glass. "No, Vanessa. You humiliated yourself in front of people with standards. You have always resented me. That would require caring what you think of me." She inhaled sharply. "David says you're revising legal documents. David should read legal documents more carefully next time." Silence. Then lower, colder. "You would destroy your own son's life to make a point? I am refusing to finance its worst version. You think you're powerful because you have paperwork." I let that sit for a beat. "No," I said. "I know I was powerful before you noticed the paperwork. That was your error." She hung up. On Friday morning, the board meeting was scheduled. Ellis Holdings had a glass-walled conference room downtown that David once described as finally feeling like a real company, as if the decades we spent making payroll in less photogenic buildings had been theater leading up to marble counters. I arrived 10 minutes early. Nora was already there with files organized into color-coded folders, because competence always looks less dramatic than chaos and